Welcome to the Make a Mental Note podcast, where mental health professionals share information and perspectives that illuminate, educate, and is worthy of a mental note. And now your host, Chris Quarto.
Hey everyone, this is Chris Quarto. Welcome to the Make a Mental Note podcast. Well, my mental health tip for today has to do with acceptance. And let me start with this quote. Just think about this one. Today, I will live in acceptance rather than expectation. Today, I will live in acceptance rather than expectation. Isn't that profound? I mean, when you think about how many of our problems that we have day in and day out are based on what we expect, either of ourselves or of other people. And then when those things don't come to fruition, it really bothers us. And for some people, it contributes to real serious problems, anxiety, depression. And I think the goal is to learn how to accept things that aren't the way we want them to be or expect them to be. But, that's easier said than done, isn't it? Well, I guess that's my challenge for you this week in terms of improving mental wellness, is try to be aware of those times when you are expecting something to be a certain way. And when it doesn't work out that way, notice how you react to that. And if possible, try to just tweak that reaction a little bit. Maybe that involves tweaking the expectation and maybe saying to yourself prior to the event, if you can anticipate, whatever happens in this situation happens. I would like it to work out this particular way, but if it doesn't, that's just the way that it is, and to accept that. So that's my challenge for you this week. And this actually relates to the topic of this week's podcast with Matt Boone, who is here to talk about acceptance and commitment therapy. And here's Matt. Hi, everyone. Welcome again to the Make a Mental Note podcast. I am joined today by Matt Boone, who's, among other things, a licensed clinical social worker, author, and trainer. And Matt, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Not a problem at all. Thanks for joining us. Well, share with the mental note takers a little bit about who you are and what type of work you do, Matt.
So, as you said, I'm a clinical social worker, and I practice psychotherapy, and my specialty is in something called acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, said as one word, not three initials.
Okay.
And for 10 years, I worked in the College Counseling Center at Cornell University. So I cut my teeth working with college students after briefly working in community mental health. And then for the last 4 years, I've worked with veterans in Little Rock, Arkansas.
Ah, okay. So you've done a lot of different things, and you had mentioned ACT, which I want to get into that in a little while. But before we even get into that, why don't we go back, and if you could just kind of share your story about how you got into the helping profession. What was the attraction there?
Well, it's a useful story, actually, for talking about acceptance and commitment therapy, because it ties right into the techniques and the lessons of acceptance and commitment therapy. So okay. In my early 20s, I was an undergraduate student and also an aspiring professional musician. Oh. And I played guitar and still do. Uh-huh. And at some point when I was about 22 years old, I started having persistent pain in both of my hands and all the way up through my forearms.
Wow.
So much so that I went on a course of seeking treatment for about 2 years, reducing the number of courses I was taking at school and devoting a lot of energy to trying to figure out what was going on with me.
Yeah.
And 2 years of treatment and multiple diagnoses and various kinds of interventions, and still I had the same pain. And no one could explain why or find a diagnosis or intervention that made a difference.
Okay.
And it was so debilitating that I couldn't do things like I couldn't handwrite and I couldn't type. And I was an English major as an undergraduate, so those were very important things for me to do, to take notes and to type. And this was in the days before dictation software, so I had to sit next to someone who would be writing at my Apple IIc Plus while I came up with papers about Shakespeare and Chaucer. And as you might imagine, this was really overwhelming for me at the time. Not only could I not really play the guitar anymore, I couldn't basically do anything with my hands. And in the middle of this experience, I did find some things that made a difference, even if they didn't make the pain go away. And the two things that made the biggest difference were meditation and psychotherapy. And my psychotherapist was big on the idea of acceptance, like with not struggling with things that we can't change. I think he was drawing it from a 12-step kind of perspective. And, chronic pain is the sort of thing where it's something that you can't necessarily change until it changes, especially if you've had it for a long time and there's no solution to it. And if you are mentally fighting with it, like, why is this happening to me? What's wrong with me? What's going to happen with my life if I have this problem? And then sort of behaviorally fighting with it too, like doing things that makes it worse, or on the other side, doing nothing to prevent being in pain so much so that your life becomes kind of narrow and kind of barren. If those are the things that you're doing, it becomes an even bigger problem than just pain. And so the acceptance perspective made a big difference for me. And in that acceptance perspective, he taught me to be mindful and to meditate. Mindfulness was already a big thing in the 90s in California where I grew up. And, being mindful allowed me to just kind of notice that the pain in my hands was different from all the stuff my mind added to it. So on one side was this physical sensation of pain, which is merely a sensation. And then added to it was all the stuff that my mind would do, like criticizing myself for doing things that would put me in pain, stewing endlessly about why I had this problem and how I was going to solve it. Basically fretting constantly. So I was quite anxious all the time. It was a perfect metaphor, right? Like I had no control over my life because I couldn't use my hands. I couldn't grab anything, both literally and metaphorically. And so that giant uncertainty and sense of out of control created a ton of anxiety for me. But being mindful and working on acceptance helped me be a little bit more sturdy in the face of this pain. And so there are two things that came out of that. So when I was actually, not worrying and ruminating, but actually kind of usefully problem solving about what sort of career could I engage in without using my hands, I thought of psychotherapy and social work. Little did I know that I'd have to write, oodles and oodles of progress notes. But at the time I thought, this psychotherapy is making an enormous difference in my life. And what if I could make my living by talking to people? And I was drawn to the field of social work because I was always interested also not just in, the problems that exist within people, but the problems that exist in the environment or the social environment or the context and how those things interact with one another. So social work was a real good fit for that. And then later when I had become a psychotherapist for a while, I just stumbled onto acceptance and commitment therapy, which kind of put into a very useful conceptual model and a kind of set of techniques, the kind of lessons that I had already learned, which were basically don't struggle with your pain, just notice what your mind is adding to your experience and let your life be guided by what's important to you, not by trying to stay away from pain as much as possible.
Well, what's interesting about your story, Matt, is it reminds me of previous episodes of the podcast where we've had guests that have shared stories from their either from their childhoods or from their adult years, where they had experienced some significant event or series of events, and those events played a big role in their career choice. whether it was dealing with anxiety themselves as children and wanting to make a difference as an adult, and so going into the field to make a difference. And so I think that in your case, it sounds like that's very similar. There are these, I guess we call them critical incidents like this that happen that have a big impact on career choice.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know many people in the helping professions who weren't drawn to them in some way, in part by what they'd experienced themselves.
Yeah.
Whether through their own pain or through early experiences with being a helper or counselor to other people, both those things drive us towards the helping professions. Although I don't think they're necessarily required of you to be a good helper or psychotherapist or counselor or social worker.
Yeah. Well, why don't you share with the mental note takers a little bit more about acceptance and commitment therapy? I mean, I think we've gotten kind of a taste of that from your
Sure.
story, and you've referred to it. But tell us a little bit more about that approach, Matt.
So, ACT comes from the CBT tradition, but kind of more from the behavioral side of the CBT tradition, and it draws on a lot of basic behavioral principles like operant conditioning and classical conditioning and things maybe you haven't thought about much since graduate school. And it draws on a lot of principles like exposure, like approaching things that you would otherwise avoid if doing so would make a difference in your life. But the thing that's different about it from traditional cognitive behavioral therapy is there are absolutely no efforts to directly change thoughts and feelings in any way. So what we want to do instead is to help people develop a different relationship with thoughts and feelings. No thought is bad. No feeling is bad. Even the ones that our minds tend to say are bad or dangerous, they're really just experiences.
Okay.
But it's our minds that kind of add, just like in my experience with pain, add this veneer of meaning that kind of make things that are not dangerous into lions and tigers and bears. And so in place of the cognitive strategies from traditional cognitive behavioral therapy where you'd look at the evidence for and against a thought or a series of thoughts, or do behavioral experiments to kind of prove or disprove a thought, ACT strategies for dealing with the mind are all grounded in mindfulness. So rather, what you might do is sort of simply adopt the habit of saying, well, my mind is saying that everyone must like me. I'll just notice that. And what might I do in my behavior that's kind of more useful for my life than trying to please everybody? So it might just be a simple kind of mental noting. And then it might be a little bit more elaborate. Like we might do a mindfulness exercise where you add a little bit of visualization and you imagine your thoughts as like leaves on a floating stream in front of you and just watch them go by, not to make them go away, but just to get some distance for them. Or you might notice them as like clouds in the sky floating by. You might do some kind of crazy things, like take a difficult thought like I'm a bad person and repeat it over and over and over again until it becomes more just like a bunch of sounds. And so you begin to notice other aspects of these thoughts, that they are kind of collections of sounds and consonants. They're not necessarily a literal truth. You might look very closely at the function and impact of the thoughts, basically how useful it is for you and how it operates in your life, but not try to change it in any way. And then we kind of try to divorce the kind of one-to-one correspondence that people assume between thinking and acting. So if people will often say, well, why did you lash out at that person? Well, they'd say, well, I lashed out because I was angry. Well, that's an interesting assumption that an emotion causes a behavior. Or then why did you feel sad? Well, I feel sad because I, thought I'm a bad person. Well, what if we worked on disconnecting those kind of assumed connections between thought and behavior and thought and feeling? Now, we get a lot more traction with behavior than we do with feeling. So we might do strategies like, why don't you think a thought like, I can't stand up, while at the same time you stand up right now? So you do these sort of, you can notice that these interventions are all quite experiential, right? There's a big part in ACT, which is about if we're going to undermine the influence of the mind and thinking and meaning-making on our lives where it gets in our way, then we have to teach this to you experientially. We can't just talk about it. And so a lot of the strategies will often look like the sort of things you'd see in Gestalt therapy or other humanistic therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea is to do these things so that you can let something else guide your behavior besides what just happens to show up in your mind at any given moment.
Mm-hmm.
And trying to get away from pain, which is something that we all are prone to do, but a lot of the people in our offices make, getting away from pain their full-time job. Think of the person with agoraphobia or panic disorder or OCD. Their whole disorder is about trying not to feel anxious.
Uh-huh.
And yet that becomes the exact problem they're trying to solve.
Right.
So rather than trying to stay away from pain, we're going to spend some time articulating very clearly what's important and what a vital and meaningful life would look like. We call that values in ACT. And as we articulate that, we're also going to kind of start engaging in experiments and behavior to start moving in the direction of those things, regardless of what we think or feel in any given moment. Sort of, and this is a metaphor we use in ACT, holding those thoughts and feelings lightly and bringing them with us, not as our enemy, but as our invited guest.
Okay. That's interesting. Well, as I listen to you talk about this is because you said that it had some similarities to CBT, or maybe it's based on that. But when you look at how you're talking about this in relation to something like REBT, which really is the polar opposite in terms of trying to fight those irrational thoughts or argue with those irrational thoughts, this is really quite different, isn't it?
It is. And, I've seen some REBT therapists and cognitive therapists who are very skilled do that cognitive restructuring or reappraisal kind of skill with their clients and teach to their clients in a very gentle and flexible way.
Uh-huh.
So it doesn't become so much like arguing. It becomes more like an invitation to, entertain different kinds of thoughts.
I see.
And so what the ACT folks, the people who developed ACT, and ACT is very grounded in research. I think it's on, it's probably on the very high end of research-based therapies.
Uh-huh.
What ACT was developed out of was this worry that if we work too hard to change thoughts, that we might have the effect of suppression, which is that it makes thoughts rebound much more strongly than they were in the first place. Same thing with feeling.
Uh-huh.
And so that whole science of suppression, which is like, if you try not to think of a white bear, then what's going to happen? On average, you're more likely to think of a white bear. There have been study after study after study after study showing its effects. So we don't want to get into any strategies that might mobilize that kind of rebound of suppression. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to say that cognitive therapy does that, but bad cognitive therapy certainly does that.
Right. Uh-huh.
So we're going to kind of get out of the business of trying to argue down a thought. I think a lot of people already have that skill.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people talk back to themselves all day long, but it doesn't change their thoughts in any way.
Right.
It just becomes an argument in their head. So what we might do in ACT, we might say, let's step back and mindfully notice the argument. And let's have some willingness to just have the argument that it's going to be there. It's been there for years. It's been going on. It doesn't have to go away. And then at the same time, let's see if we can move in the direction of what we care about, not waiting for the argument to go away or the negative thought to go away before we do what's meaningful, like, take our kids to the baseball game or go on a vacation or really put our full energy into our job.
Mm-hmm.
We're gonna not wait around for life to start. We're not going to wait around for pain to go away before life starts.
Right. So really, one of the things it sounds like you're trying to get clients to do is to be more of an observer of their thoughts as opposed to trying to perhaps be part of fighting the thoughts or something like that. Is that kind of what it is in a sense?
Yes, that's exactly what we're trying to do. In fact, the language of observer is language that we often use in that.
Okay. All right. So what would you say to a person who says, well, this acceptance and commitment therapy, it sounds good, but the only thing that you're really doing with the acceptance part is just the person is just basically giving in, or they're just kind of giving up, and they're not really doing anything, to change their lives for the better. You're just having them observe, and they're not doing anything. They're just basically giving up if they're accepting what's there. I mean, how would you respond to something like that, Matt?
Well, I would say if that's what I was talking about, then you shouldn't come see me, because that would be a horrible therapy. And that it's understandable that people would hear the word acceptance and think resignation, giving up, like giving over to this pain and letting it rule your life. But when we say acceptance, we mean more something like willingness, which is often a word we'll use with clients, because acceptance can be so loaded. We're going to say, no, we're not going to accept the horrible circumstances in your life. In fact, if there are changeable circumstances in your life, we desperately want to help you change them. However, if you're going to make a difference in your life, let's say you're the person with agoraphobia who has trouble leaving the house. Well, do you think it's at all possible that you could leave the house and not have an enormous swell of anxiety the first time you do it, and maybe the next 10 times you do it? So could we help you through this therapy, through experiential exercises and practice in the office, be willing to have all that discomfort? And we're not just going to help you be willing to have that discomfort. We're going to help you be willing in the service of something that you have identified that is important to you. Like, I want to have a life that's not dictated by anxiety. I want to be a good and loving parent. I want to be engaged in my community. Those might be the things that act as a compass point for a person with agoraphobia leaving the house. And we're going to give you practice having that anxiety. Like, I'm likely to have you in my office and, see if we can stir up that anxiety a little bit and give you skills to just simply have that anxiety through experiential exercises, through mindfulness. It's a little bit like, it's a very kind, gentle kind of exposure therapy. Exposure therapy, that's really, this is kind of an oversimplification, but it's that side of CBT that ACT really comes from. Those principles of approach rather than avoid, and that over time, without trying to directly change your thoughts, you learn that there are more possibilities, and that anxiety isn't going to kill you, and that you can have thoughts and feelings that are painful and yet still move through your life meaningfully.
Well, I heard you say a few minutes ago that with some of these clients that you work with, one of the primary themes of their issues is avoidance, is that they avoid certain situations so their anxiety, I guess, stays at a tolerable level. Have you found with other clients that there are any themes that seem to characterize their issues besides avoidance?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, we kind of think of avoidance, or in ACT we call it experiential avoidance, as kind of a universal kind of diathesis. Like it's a core, but not the entire picture, but it's a core in most problems that we see in our offices and across the DSM spectrum and beyond. But that being said, it would be oversimple to say that that's the only thing going on in there. So other themes kind of tie into the influence of the mind and language and meaning making. That a lot of the themes are about people living out particular narratives that they've kind of learned about themselves over their lives without noticing that there's something beyond that narrative. So let's take the example of, a person who was abused as a child. Now, sometimes it's really useful. In fact, I've met quite a lot of people who found this useful to consider themselves a survivor, or to kind of practice a little bit of acceptance by acknowledging that some of the strong emotions they have are a result of having had sexual abuse as a child. So that can be quite useful. But there are ways in which those narratives can also hamstring people, can trip them up, because they live out this idea of a broken person. And therefore, they live in broken ways. So if you think, I'm unlovable because of this experience I had, it's quite likely that and if you listen to your mind in the way we've been talking about, not in a kind of stepping back mindful way, but in kind of the way that most of us do, we treat it as a literal truth or a thing to guide our behaviors, then you might be living in an unlovable way. Living out that narrative might drive your substance abuse or your unsafe sexual behavior or not asking for a raise at your job or not really engaging deeply with an intimate partner. So there are ways in which one of the reasons why we really want to step back from the mind and really notice how it operates and the process of thinking and creating meaning is that has such an influence on our behavior.
Yeah.
And there's these characteristic things that, all therapists see in their life, like the kinds of things that in traditional cognitive therapy we might call core beliefs. But, things like, I'm unlovable or I have to please everybody or I'm the kind of person who, now insert something in there, right? We're all walking around with this like conceptualized idea of who we are, and it becomes rigid and inflexible, and then we just live that way, not seeing that there might be other possibilities for living.
Well, you mentioned a couple of words that I think are very important, and you said that people have these narratives, and you also used the word meaning, and I think that both of those are very important. To me, when I think about a narrative, I think about a person's take on an issue, or on, in the case of a client, maybe their take, their explanation, or their understanding of themselves, their experiences, and who they are. And to me, I think, can't those narratives be changed? And I suppose for some clients, it's difficult to change those narratives, but perhaps with ACT, you have ways of helping them do that.
Well, I guess, this is where ACT becomes a little counterintuitive. Because we are not, if we see a narrative that is dysfunctional or gets in someone's way, our goal is not, therefore, to give them a better narrative.
Okay.
Our goal is to understand how that narrative operates in their life and to give them experiences where they notice that narrative for what it is, as a narrative. And if we're going to draw on language, we're going to draw on it to identify values. So the values that a client might come up with in my office are, I want to be a let's think about therapist values. I want to be a hardworking and engaged therapist. I want to listen deeply and be present for my clients. When I go home at the end of the day, I want to be there for my children and my spouse, even though I've been listening to difficult stories all day long.
Yeah.
And when the weekend comes, I want to engage in nature and in fun and in leisure and in my community with the same vital energy that I engage with my work and my family. Now, so that's language, right? That's just a bunch of words that we came up with that serve as a guiding principle.
Yep.
We don't have to come up with a better story about who you are or better ideas about whether or not you're good or bad, because what we've learned is that learning is not subtractive, it's additive. So if you have an old, dusty, tired, worn-out story that makes your life difficult, it's unlikely that we're going to be able to remove that. That story will likely keep showing up. And so what we want to do is not author a new story, but author a new life through engaging in behaviors that are about these values that you described. So it's sort of a different take on using language.
Yeah, and I think as I was listening to you, I was thinking, well, maybe really instead of making an attempt to change the narrative, is to understand the narrative and what function it serves for a client.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a better description there.
Absolutely. Function is a big word we use. That's a word from the behavioral tradition, which is sort of about what is the role or the impact of any behavior on your life.
Right.
What does it bring you? What are the payoffs, whether you know about them or not, whether they're positive or not? What do you get from the behavior? It's sort of tied to that truism that kind of occurs in most therapies where we say, whatever you got, you came by honestly, right? This is learning. This is what you've learned over the course of your life. And that's the perspective that we're taking, is that any behavior that shows up in your life is behavior that you spent a long time learning to do quite perfectly.
Right.
whether you knew it or not.
Yes. So if you look at clients that you've worked with, Matt, the ones in particular that you've had success working with, and if you look at where they've been, where they were when they came in to see you at point A, and then at the moment or at the time when they're ready to leave therapy at point B, they've achieved their goals. Is there any recipe for success in that you've used in helping people get from point A to point B? I mean, what's your recipe for success in helping people move from one point to another?
Well, I guess there are two things that I would say that come to mind just in this moment. The first is to draw on a well-developed evidence-based model of change. So that I would say that acceptance and commitment therapy is that. It's basic. It's grounded in basic psychological science. It's grounded in tons and tons of randomized controlled trials for, a multitude of problems. But, that only will take you so far. The other recipe, I think, is to, if you're going to implement a therapy, is to implement it as authentically and as honestly as you can as yourself. Your best tool as a therapist is yourself.
Yeah.
And the best advice I got in my whole career probably was right in the beginning. I started off training in Boston in a psychodynamic training institute when I was a graduate student, and it was an amazing training experience. But I looked around, and I sort of, my eyes landed on the folks in that training institute who fit the kind of stereotype of the psychoanalytic therapist. They were very quiet. They nodded. They rubbed their chin. They, and they were amazing therapists. This is not to demean them. These are like people I admired and still do. But they had a particular style of being a therapist that was particularly them, and I thought that was the right way to be. And your listeners might notice, just the way I talk. As I'm talking right now, I'm wandering around the room I'm in. I'm moving my hands. I talk really fast. I'm full of energy. I've always been that way.
Yep.
And one of my supervisors, who kind of fit this mold, said, Matt, what I would hope for you is that you become not just a really good therapist, which you already are, but you become the best therapist as you. And that you bring this part of your personality into the therapy room, because I don't see that part coming into the therapy room.
Wow.
And that, that stopped me cold, because I had this rule, and in fact we talk a lot about rules our minds might have about how the world's supposed to go and how we're supposed to live. I had this rule that good therapy meant being quiet, being still. And this really changed the game for me, because over the next couple of years, I thought about that a lot, and I really tried to break those rules and to be as human as possible, to be as Matt as possible, to not worry unnecessarily about these strictures in psychotherapy about professional boundaries. Like, I think they're really, really important, but we can hold them so rigidly that we're not even human with everybody.
Right. Yep.
And so I got more comfortable with very selective, clinically indicated self-disclosure, with just letting my normal humor come into the therapy room and just being myself.
Yeah.
And so I have this set of tools and a model of conceptualization, which is acceptance and commitment therapy, but I'm doing it as me. I'm not doing it as the people I idolize in the field. I'm not trying to be Stephen Hayes, the guy who kind of developed that to begin with, or some of the other people who have trained me. I'm being Matt Boone doing it. And that creates an enormous amount of freedom. And the most important piece of that is that all these skills I use, they're not really skills, but I guess they are skills, but all these things I do as myself are ways that I relate. So I was tying my hands behind my back by not relating to people in the way I knew how to relate.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. That makes total sense. I was wondering, was it, because we're talking about acceptance and commitment therapy, was it hard for you to accept the fact that you might have to change from what you thought was the right way to do therapy to a different way that you weren't necessarily committed to at first or felt comfortable with at first?
Oh, absolutely. Like all the things I've been describing to you about clients all apply to me.
Uh-huh.
So in order to be this kind of therapist I'm describing, and of course I'm a work in progress, right? I haven't arrived.
Yeah.
I had to, face and be with and be willing to have all the discomfort of doing it differently and the vulnerability I felt kind of breaking the rules. I had to notice and hold lightly the rules I had and notice them as like I got this kind of construct of like who a therapist is supposed to be. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Just notice that. And then I had to think, here's the values piece. I had, well, what am I going after here? Well, I'm going after being as much help to my clients as possible. And so I'm willing to do this uncomfortable stuff because it's about something important. It's not just let's be uncomfortable for uncomfortable sake or to be a tough guy. So absolutely. Yeah. And it's still, I still find myself, following kind of unexamined or unarticulated rules about how I'm supposed to do it. Even as an ACT therapist, sometimes I find myself doing ACT the way I think ACT is supposed to be. I find myself not being entirely authentic with my clients. So, I don't want to give any of your listeners, especially the ones who are in training, because I'm really invested in the training of new professionals, that, there's a point where you arrive and you're now the perfect therapist and you've got it all worked out, because that's just not the case.
No.
I think I struggle every day, and I put my foot in my mouth every day, and that's just part of the process.
Yeah, it never stops. I mean, it
never stops.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this. I mean, because you've probably had a lot of challenging clients that you've worked with over the years, and I'm sure that getting some clients to buy in to the whole concept of counseling can be challenging at times, and what you're asking them to do. So what's the key to get a client to buy into change?
Ooh, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
I will start by saying sometimes I fail. I will also say that some of the things I've learned not to do, or to sort of, again, hold lightly, are to make these kinds of assumptions like, well, they just don't want to change, or they're just not ready. I think it's a more useful conceptualization to say, as we say in dialectical behavior therapy, which is a therapy that's similar to ACT and another therapy I practice in a more limited way, is say, if the therapy fails, well, maybe the therapy is failing the client, not the client failing the therapy.
Yeah.
So I often think, how can I approach this challenging client, if my mind wants to call them that, with some compassion and some lightness and some understanding that maybe it's just I don't have the skill or the right tools or haven't figured out quite yet the best way to draw them in.
Yeah, and I think
so I want to go in.
I was just going to say that kind of gets back to what we were talking about earlier about what's the function of the behavior. There may be a reason that there's not a connection there. And if you look at it from that standpoint, I think that really informs what you can do or what's going on at least, and helps you kind of understand, well, maybe I need to tweak something myself.
That's exactly right. I mean, if someone is engaging in like the behaviors that we might ascribe to a so-called difficult client, I've learned from ACT and also from DBT to really think about, well, how is this a learned behavior? How is this that they're doing in my office, whether it's kicking and screaming or sitting in silence or just not engaging with me, how is that also like a survival strategy for them? How has that been something that they've learned to do that has really been useful for them in some other context that is just not being very useful for them right now?
Yeah.
And so when I can think about that and as a second step, tune into as best I can whatever pain is driving this behavior, then my behavior changes. And I become less rigid and inflexible. I become more open to possibilities, right?
Yeah.
Again, we're talking ACT processes here. I become, the term we use in ACT is actually psychologically flexible, which basically allows me to be more open to experience, more attuned to what's going on right now, and more connected to what's important and what's going to work here.
Right.
So often when I've got that difficult client in my office, my urge is to lean forward and push back because I'm human.
Yes.
And what I've learned over time, that the best thing I can do is take a deep breath, sit back, slow down, and like really listen to whatever pain is driving this kind of behavior. And I find that when I get traction with those difficult clients, that's the way I get traction.
I see.
You know, when I acknowledge, like, no, of course you wouldn't want to talk to this stranger, or yeah, I've watched the same movies that make therapy look totally ridiculous,
Yeah.
or I can hear that you come from a culture or a family where seeking professional support was totally demonized. So, like, I get it, and so you don't have to come back.
Uh-huh.
But if you want to take a risk, like, I'm going to be here, and I'm going to try and work my hardest to help you because I'm interested in change here. I'm interested in helping you get through whatever you're dealing with. I'm not interested in judging you or being superior or, a lot of the things that they're probably worried that the therapist is doing. Although
right.
he's saying that's not going to make those thoughts and worries go away necessarily.
Yeah. Well, Matt, this last part of the interview, it's called, I call it Make a Mental Note, and it's something that you feel it's important for the audience to make a mental note of in terms of improving their mental health or their relationships. Do you have any maybe tips or suggestions, some words of wisdom that might help an audience member improve their mental wellness or their relationships, even if just a little bit?
Sure. I could probably repeat some of the things I said before, but something that's jumping to mind right now is something that is a kind of truism of both ACT and I think the language actually comes from DBT. There's a lot of overlap in both those therapies because there's so much focus on acceptance.
Uh-huh.
And this idea is the difference between being right and being effective.
Mm-hmm.
So when we say being right, what I'm talking about is kind of living out these judgments and these ideas of right and wrong and how the world is supposed to be that we all do. We all probably know that person in our life who is just willing to die on all the wrong hills, who is, going to cut their nose off to spite their face or shoot themselves in the foot or whatever other violent metaphor you want to come up with. Basically, they do things that get in their own way because they're holding to some righteous indignation, or they're holding to some idea about how people are supposed to behave, or how they are supposed to behave. So that's like the being right.
Okay.
And I would suggest that when people notice themselves doing that they try to focus on, well, what would actually be effective for what I'm going after in my life? So let's take an example. Let's say, and this is by no way has anything to do with my relationships or anything that's ever happened in my life. Say you have like a spouse who doesn't do something around the house that you want them to do.
Okay.
And maybe you've been working on it for years and years and years, and maybe they still don't do it. Maybe they leave the dishes in the sink every day, or they never clean up the kitchen, or whatever it is that that is your persnicket or your pet peeve.
Yep.
Now, this person, your spouse, may have said a million times that yes, I'm going to do that, but they haven't done it. Well, in this situation, your mind could convince you very deeply that you're right, and yes, again, you need to push on this issue and try to make this issue happen.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Try to make them do the thing that they said they were going to do.
Right.
And yet it may be that your experience tells you that actually doesn't do much for your relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't do much for the connection you feel with your partner and her or his connection with you.
Right.
So if you step back and think, well, what do I actually care about here beyond the dishes getting done?
Yep.
Well, I care about having a loving and open and respectful relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And I care about, being the best partner I can be. So what would be effective in the service of that?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it might be engaging in some other kinds of behaviors around this issue or letting that issue go.
Mm-hmm.
We all devote so much energy to trying to change the behavior of people around us, and we can't change other people's behaviors,
right?
No matter how much we kick and scream.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the core lesson of ACT is, can we let go of trying to change the things that are not changeable? It's very much like the Serenity Prayer in AA.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So let's acutely attuned to what is not changeable in our life. And let's get out of the business of trying to change it, whether it's the feelings that show up inside of us or the behaviors of the people in our lives. And let's put our energy into what we really care about. What is effective for what we're going after in life?
Yeah.
And often when we think in those terms, we stop doing these things that are kind of like banging our heads against the wall or doing the same thing and expecting a different outcome.
Right.
And we actually build a kind of more rich, a more varied, a more flexible life that's kind of more rewarding to us.
Yeah.
So the sum of that is, do I want to be right or do I want to be effective for what I'm going after?
Yeah, that reminds me of the old solution-focused idea. If what you're doing doesn't work, then you do something different, and
Right.
It's that idea. Well, you've really provided the audience with great information about ACT. I think I have a much better understanding of it myself. I didn't realize that it had traditions and a foundation in both cognitive behavioral and the traditional behavioral approaches. So that was interesting to learn. Now, I know that you do some training in the area. Actually, you have a training in the Nashville area where I am in September. I don't think this podcast will be coming out until after that, but do you have upcoming trainings in the fall or through the winter, or how does that all work?
Sure. So I do a lot of 2-day workshops, and ACT workshops are very experiential. We're going to take you through all the exercises we might take our clients through. It's a very heartfelt kind of feeling kind of workshop. It's not the sort of thing where you sit in the back and just absorb information from 1,000 PowerPoint slides and take notes. And I find them really meaningful. It's one of the things that drew me to ACT is that they were so transformative for me, these workshops, as I was learning through the therapy with my clients. So I quickly got into training people in ACT because I found it so rewarding. So what I do are these 2-day workshops, and you can learn about them through my website, which is MatthewSBoone.com. That's Matthew with 2 T's, S as in Sam, Boone, all one word.
All right.
MatthewSBoone.com, or you can go to the website, probably even easier, of a company called Praxis, Praxis, and they're a trading company that's brand new. It's built out of it's sort of an offshoot of the publishing company New Harbinger Publications, which published a lot of books that are on people's shelves. So they've created this training arm called Praxis, and not just me, a lot of other folks like me are providing these 2-day trainings around the country. We call it Act 1. It's an introduction to ACT, and I'll be doing one in Nashville in September. I'll be doing one in St. Louis in October, but there's also ones in San Antonio and the Midwest and the Northwest and all over the country. And so people are interested in a 2-day workshop. Those would be great to attend, and they're usually pretty affordable, especially if you're a student. They're usually half off for students.
Nice.
And then a really cool thing, too, is Praxis puts on a twice-yearly 4-day workshop called ACT Boot Camp. And what that is 4-day intensive experiential training with some of the leading lights in acceptance and commitment therapy, like Stephen Hayes, who was one of the founders, and people like Kelly Wilson and Robin Walzer, who were right there at the beginning of the Development Act and whose trainings I learned enormously from. So the next one of those is going to be in Tampa in November, and that's a blast, really fun, really meaningful. And then more broadly, I'm part of a professional organization called the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science, or ACBS. And that professional organization, our website, has links to trainings all over the country that people are doing. One of the cool things in ACT is that we don't certify trainers, and we don't certify therapists either. For trainers, what we have is a peer review. So in order to become an ACBS peer-reviewed trainer, I had to submit a dossier of videotapes of my training, of articles I've written, letters from people in the community saying how I've contributed to the community, and I have to show a set of basic competencies. But I didn't have to pay anything to do it. I just had to pay this years of developing the skill.
Interesting.
So there are about 80 around the world, international ACBS peer-reviewed trainers. And they're listed on our website. And a lot of us also do individual consultation with people via Skype or in person. And the cool thing is that there's not one way to do ACT or not one way to learn ACT. So every trainer does something a little bit different.
Yeah. That's great. Well, I'll make sure and put all of the links to those websites and everything that you were just talking about in the show notes. So if anybody wants to go to a training or contact you or whatnot, they'll have that information that they can get in the show notes. And
amazing.
I really appreciate you coming on here today, Matt, and sharing your thoughts and your expertise with the audience, and hopefully they'll get a lot out of it.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Chris. It's been my pleasure.
Okay, thanks. Wow, wasn't that really good stuff? I mean, I learned so much from listening to that. I mean, I was kind of feeling, I don't know if you guys felt the same way, but as I was listening to Matt talk, I was thinking, man, I would love to go see him if I were in need of mental health services. Well, let me give you my mental notes takeaway for today's interview. Acceptance and commitment therapy, it helps clients look at what's important to them and what a vital and meaningful life would look like to them. So focusing on values is key. And ACT therapists help clients engage in behaviors that move them in the direction of their values. So regardless of what they're thinking or feeling in a given moment. And as Matt said, encouraging clients to bring their thoughts and feelings along for the ride as invited guests. Wasn't that cool? I thought that was a really neat way of conceptualizing that. Well, you know, one of my goals with the Make a Mental Note podcast episodes is to help listeners learn about different mental health issues. And my whole line of thinking is healing through learning. So I'm convinced that for people in general, the lay people, for anybody, even therapists who are kind of having to take care of themselves as self-care practice, that learning about yourself, learning about issues promotes healing. So that's what I hope that you guys get out of this by listening to these podcast episodes. So along these lines, I always pose questions at the end of these podcast interviews to kind of help in the learning process. And here's my question for you today. In the context of acceptance and commitment therapy, does acceptance mean giving up or resigning yourself to the fact that things will never get better? Well, no. Matt said that acceptance equates to willingness. So clients aren't asked to accept the terrible things that might be happening in their lives, but they're asked if they'd be willing to be uncomfortable in the short term while they're learning skills to help them do things that they would typically avoid in order to achieve their goal of a meaningful life. So that's what it's all about. Okay, well, please visit my website, chrisquarto.com, for the show notes of this episode. And hey, if you wouldn't mind, do me a favor and tell your friends and colleagues about the podcast on Facebook and Twitter. I think that people would get a lot out of these podcast episodes, learning about themselves and others. Thanks again, and have a great day.